Welcome to Community Chat. This program, as you know, is best served for providing information to you, the community. Today, we have a great guest. Joining us is Mr. Mike Festa. He is the AARP Massachusetts State Director, and he's here today to discuss a new study that documents the financial strain on family caregivers and also the recently introduced Credit Caring Act that would actually provide a tax credit of up to $5,000 to eligible caregivers. Mike, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Kevin, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on your program and to talk about what I think a lot of folks, your listeners, are going to appreciate, because we're focused on supporting caregivers, and there are a lot of them in Massachusetts, that's for sure.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with AARP.
Sure. Well, I'm an attorney, and for many, many years, I served in the House of Representatives, actually in Massachusetts, representing the north of Boston district, Melrose, Stoneham, Wakefield. And then I served as the Secretary of Elder Affairs under Governor Deval Patrick for a period of time. I joined AARP as the state director about 8.5 years ago now. So I'm firmly ensconced in the world of AARP, and in many ways, in my background, I've done a lot of work as a legislator, certainly focused on senior related issues, people 50 plus generally, but certainly along the way, getting to know caregivers, understanding and appreciating the challenges that are presented, and then, of course, with the pandemic exacerbating a lot of those conditions that I'm sure we'll talk about in this interview.
Just so everybody knows what the definition is, what is a family caregiver and what is it that they do?
Well, let's start with acknowledging that caregivers are essentially family members, but they can also be friends and even neighbors in some cases, but they're providing help of some sort to a loved one or someone close to them. It's usually a parent or a spouse or a sibling. And what we're talking about here are the kinds of things that, kind of common sense. It's going out, getting the groceries, helping around the house, helping with personal care issues, dealing with mobility issues, cooking, cleaning, et cetera. So it can, in some cases, be fairly complex. Actually, I mean, we know one of the other studies we've done earlier, which, essentially is part of what we're now going to be talking about. But historically, one of the things that I thought we found, the AARP found was really extraordinary, is that many of our caregivers are providing what I would characterize as pretty complicated, complex medical care. We're talking about, putting in the insulin in and dealing with PICCs, the needles and, and things of that nature. And I would tell you that one of the concerns we've had on that score is that, frankly, there's not a lot of training. One of the bills that passed years ago was to support the training of those who are asked to take care of a loved one leaving the hospital. And there's actually a law in Massachusetts that requires that before you get discharged, a loved one leaves the hospital and goes back to home, that designated caregiver, this is a voluntary thing, but the designated caregiver would be receiving some hands-on training just so they'll know when they go back home, what to do in these complicated cases. So caregivers come from, every generation too. I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that the loved one that's being cared for could very well be a younger person, right? Someone with complex medical needs, mobility issues, what have you. But the ones who are providing the care, can be as old as those in the silent generation, 60s, 70s, 80s. and then of course younger people, the children of those who are being cared for, et cetera. So they're of many ages. The common denominator, frankly, is that they want to help, and they do help someone else to improve the quality of their life.
Let's talk a little bit about whether it's the genesis of the study or what it basically was able to uncover when it comes to the financial strains of
Sure.
being that family caregiver.
Yeah. Well, this may be a surprise to your listeners, but the study showed that almost 80% of the people who are caregivers are actually spending out-of-pocket money of their own to help that caregiver. And what's even more, I think, compelling when you think about what those numbers look like is that the average caregiver is spending well over $7,000 a year to support a loved one or someone that they're caring for. And the studies have shown that, and this particular study showed that of that amount of money, that's approximating 25% plus of their actual household income. So it's a big deal when it comes to the actual costs and the impact it has. I'm sure that there are many people who are listening, Kevin, that they themselves are caregivers. So a lot of what we're talking about rings true with them, I'm sure, because they are experiencing some of the challenges that we uncovered in this study.
I find it interesting that until our conversation here, I'm not aware of any other ways to assist caregivers. Can something actually be done to help those caregivers in need?
Well, that's the very critical question, right? And I will tell you that there's actually, we're focused now on a federal remedy, is what I would call it. It's called the Credit for Caring Act. It's something that is currently pending in the United States Congress. It's a bipartisan bill that essentially addresses this challenge by acknowledging, number one, that yes, caregivers are laying out serious money to support a loved one. And what we're trying to do, what they are seeking to do with this bill, is to provide up to $5,000 of a tax credit, which essentially would be used to help offset a significant amount of those expenses. And, ARP, of course, is strongly supporting this bill. We know how important this is for family caregivers. And what I'm happy to tell you is that two things that are important to acknowledge. Number one is there are a lot of other organizations across the country that have joined forces to support the act. There's something over 80 organizations that are currently advocating, as we are, to make this happen. The other thing is that we have in Massachusetts, where we're talking, an extraordinary delegation that have historically been very supportive of ARP issues, this being one of them. So we've got 9 Congress people, we've got 2 United States senators, and we have really a unanimous view of our delegation that this makes sense to them as well. Many of our delegation are actually co-sponsors of the act. So that's what this is about. I do want to make a quick point, Kevin. We don't have to explore it too deeply, but we are also in Massachusetts fighting for a state-based caregiver tax credit. Nice. It's up to $1,500, and it is something that is pending in the current legislative session. We are cautiously optimistic. We've gotten good support in the legislature in the past, but always getting it across the finish line is a challenge. So I just want to make that known to your listeners as well, that we're working on it at a state level as well.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me following up on that, it being
sure.
a former legislator and somebody who set policy, and how good is it to have bipartisan support, have several organizations that are backing this? Do you feel that it stands a good chance of being, signed into law, that it'll be accepted?
I actually do. I mean, I realize that most everyone acknowledges that the conditions in Washington with regard to partisanship are really hyper and not good, generally speaking. But, there are areas of policy where I think it is fair to say that it cuts across all points of view, and many of those who support the Credit for Caring Act are, conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats, and everywhere in between. Because, let's face it, we're talking 48 million people who are caregivers around the country. That's a lot of voters. That's a lot of people, constituents that our Congress people care about. Secondly, this is, there's nothing partisan about it, right? This is about acknowledging that for the sake of the families that are being able to help loved ones, keep them at home longer, that is something that I think is universally felt as a critical need and a societal need. And it also, I think it needs to be pointed out that God forbid, if you think about it, imagine if we didn't have family caregivers of the nature we have, where would those loved ones be going? A lot of them would be driven into very unfortunate, costly alternatives, nursing homes, long-term care facilities, and which is not to say that they're bad inherently, but most people, in fact, the vast majority of people really want to stay in their home as long as possible. And so if you've got a caring person that wants to be helpful to keep you in that home longer, from a policy point of view, from a societal point of view, it makes perfect sense to acknowledge their critical role. And on a financial, frankly, to help taxpayers, the more people are staying home longer means less people hitting that system where it costs, between $10,000 and $15,000 a month to keep someone in a nursing home. So it makes sense for a lot of reasons. And I would say one other thing, which is that when it comes to the bipartisan approach, this is the AARP MO. We are frankly, I think the strongest lobbyist group for older persons in this country. We have historically been, very strong, very engaged, obviously, in supporting Social Security, solvency, fighting for Medicare, protecting older folks in a variety of ways. So this is our bread and butter work. But everything we do, we always promote a bipartisan approach because we recognize that, number one, as an organization, we are nonpartisan and we don't, we're not giving money to candidates. We're not endorsing candidates. We are focused on the issue. And so if a person who's running for office is with us on the issue, that's where we will share that information with our members. So it's all about being bipartisan. It's all about acknowledging, in this case, with the Credit for Care Act, we have a lot of an impetus to get the bill passed. And I would make one last point, Kevin. I apologize for going too long, but I wanted to be sure to cover the fact that there is a lot happening in Washington when it comes to supporting caregivers and home and community-based care generally. The Biden administration, as most of your listeners may be aware, they're doing an initiative to expand long-term care options, support for long-term care. It's the personal infrastructure that the president and some of his cabinet have been talking about. And while that it clearly has a tough row to hoe because there's a lot of money involved, I think similar to the Credit for Caring Act, it all boils down to acknowledging that we are in a world where, caregivers and cared for people really need the support of government to ensure that this can continue. And this credit is obviously going to make a big difference for people's pocketbooks.
And if you are just joining our conversation, we're speaking with Mike Festa. He is the AARP Massachusetts State Director, and we're talking about the Credit Caring Act that is currently being worked on federally, but he's also in a previous answer mentioned that there is some legislation that is in the works here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So it's kind of a two-pronged attack or two-pronged approach to helping those caregivers. We're on the other side of dealing with a global pandemic. I don't know if we're necessarily out of the woods, but could you kind of talk a little bit how family givers have been affected in regards to COVID and when it hit?
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I think that the first thing that has to be said is that even if you're not a caregiver, um, experiencing the kind of isolation from other neighbors, friends, workers, co-workers, it's really hit all of us in one way or another in a negative way. It's an emotionally very draining situation. We're coming out of it. Massachusetts, we're fortunate that we have a high percentage of those vaccinated. So I think today we're doing the show on the 9th of July. And I think that yesterday there was 90 something people in the whole state that caught COVID. So we're in a good position. However, not to get too negative about it, we also are in a position where people are now talking about variants, Delta variant and other variants that may indeed recycle into environments. Certainly in some parts of the country, there's a real problem with the percentage of people vaccinated. So it's an ongoing challenge. But here's the fundamental point. Because of the pandemic, I think we have found, again, as a society, as a community, that there is a full appreciation for what caregivers have gone through before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and now coming out of the pandemic. This has really highlighted the challenges because, again, one of the things that is true is that when you don't have, if you think about the world around us, most communities have a senior center. Most communities have adult day programs where you can have your loved one dropped off for the day to engage with other seniors, have activities, socialization, et cetera. A lot of those things just shut down completely. In fact, in some communities, they're still shut down. And so it put even more focus and more pressure, frankly, on caregivers to maintain a quality of life in a circumstance where they really didn't have a lot of resources to call upon except their own, which again goes back to the original point, which is the Credit for Caring Act is a financial remedy, but it's an acknowledgement of the critical role that these family caregivers are playing, and the government essentially saying, but for you, it would have been a lot worse for these individuals, but also just collectively, it would have been a much tougher situation for, long care facilities. So we've got to do what we can to be helpful. And, by the way, on the statistics, one other statistic that I think is really important, a lot of this is in the context of people trying to maintain employment. Here's a caregiver who, mom's now home. They're home because their job has maybe they lost their job because of the pandemic. So there's even more, time, and that's good for the loved one, but that's also putting more pressure on them financially. So there's a whole series of challenges that we're dealing with. And we at ARP are saying, we've got to support our caregivers. We got to acknowledge the challenges they face. And when it comes to the amount of care, our study showed that about 32% of family caregivers are providing at least 21 hours of care a week. So we're talking serious time. And that's time that, frankly, impacts your ability to go back into the workforce. And obviously, we know that there are other employment-related challenges caused by the pandemic. So it's a perfect storm of challenge. And this is why the remedy that we've been fighting for here and talking about today is so important.
Is it worth noting? I don't know if you know the language in regards to this act. Do we know if this is going to be this would be an annual tax credit, and would there
yes
not be...
yeah okay. This would be an annual tax credit, and it would be based on what the previous year's expenses were, and the tax credit would be up to $5,000, and it's a credit. It means that even if you have no income, it's money that the government would send to you. And by the way, I know we want to talk about this too, Kevin. It's important, frankly, to talk about the disparate impact on different communities.
Sure. And I was actually going to say is we've kind of taken a blanket approach. I definitely want to dissect this a little bit more, if you will.
Exactly.
Talk about the different groups that are actually hardest hit financially.
Yeah. So first, what I think is amazing and chilling in some respects is that when we did our study, we broke it down and we looked at the Hispanic, Latino communities, we looked at the African American, Black American communities, white and Asian. So you pretty much look at all the demographics. And what we found is that Hispanic, Latino, and Black Americans, on average, they're spending 47% of their income on caregiving and expenses for Latinos. Let me be clear. Latinos were the worst shape financially. 47% household income spent on caregivers, followed by African American, Black Americans, which on average were spending 34% of their income on caregivers. And those numbers are big numbers. We're talking about, $10,000 plus in many cases. So the impact is really, really borne out with those communities of color and Hispanic communities. And so as we fight to get this passed, we are very mindful of the disparities and the inequities in the system and in the society. And so we know that this will lift all boats, but most assuredly, it will make it even more critically important. And it is more critically important for those in communities, minority communities that really have been struggling. And, for Gen X folks, when you break it down from age, they're spending, remember now, the overall average cost out of pocket, $7,200. For Gen X caregivers, it's like $8,500. And for working caregivers, I mean, this is the other thing too. You have that category of people who are either not working and are taking care of a loved one, but there are many, of course, who are working, and that is another big impact. We talked about it briefly, but we broke it out. The study focused on people who are working and caregiving, and we found that they're spending $10,200 plus on average, which is almost twice as much as caregivers who don't have work-related strains and challenges. So it's in many respects, this is a really dire situation. It's a very challenging one. And people with dementia, people with Alzheimer's, the study showed the average was close to $9,000 a year in out-of-pocket costs. So no matter how you analyze the data, the bottom line for the average caregiver is that people are spending a lot of money out of their pocket. And it's really important for the government to not only acknowledge that, but to do something about it. And that's why the current Credit for Caring Act is so important to AARP as an advocacy group, but frankly, to everyone who is a caregiver and who is concerned about this.
You are just tuning in. We are speaking with Mike Vesta. He is the AARP Massachusetts State Director, and we're talking about the cost of caregiving, a new study that has been conducted about the financial strains, and AARP's endorsement of tax credits. I believe this is called the Credit Caring Act that is being worked on the federal level. We just got a couple of minutes left with you, Mike.
Sure.
And if you would be kind enough to share a little advice that maybe you could provide to the caregivers, or even tell them what resources AARP could offer them for help.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Let me start by saying that a lot of what we've talked about, is obviously in some respects technical, and there's a lot of information. And what I'm going to suggest to folks who are listening in is that at your leisure, if you want, you can go on AARP's website. It's aarp.org.org, and then you put /caregiving. That's the category, caregiving. And when you get on our website, you will find a wealth of information and resources that can connect you and provide you with what we think will be very helpful if you are a caregiver or the one being cared for, who would like to be helpful to their caregiver, and so get that information. And I would say that we'll probably mention this one more time before we do the wrap, Kevin, but suffice to say, No matter when, what time of day or what day, you're thinking about this, you can always go on that website and you're going to get a lot of information. The other thing I would say is that it is really important to acknowledge that we're in the middle of this political, sort of calendar, and a lot of the effort, that we encourage people personally, frankly, is to share your concerns with your local state legislator, as well as your United States congressperson or senator, because they need to hear from you. The good news, as I said before, in Massachusetts, we have a delegation that's very supportive of caregivers in general, and in particular, the Credit for Caring Act. But I think even for those who support it, it's nice to hear that from constituents. So that's another thing that's not a bad idea, as far as I can see. And again, to remind everybody, the way this works is that you spend money on caregiving, you keep your receipts. It's just, when you think about taxes, you're always looking at documenting, whatever your filing is going to be. But in the case of a credit that you're seeking, add up your bills, and that's where you're going to be putting that information if it turns out to be a new law that hopefully gets passed. And you can then, up to $5,000, get a credit for the money you've paid out of pocket. So that's what we're fighting for. It's not yet the law, but hopefully, because of programs like yours, Kevin, where we can talk about this and make people more aware of it, that more and more Congress people are going to get the message that we've got to get this passed now, because this is a critical time for a lot of caregivers, and they really could use the financial support.
In our closing minute here, anything that we haven't touched upon, or anything you want to say to close out this segment that we've had together?
Well, Kevin, thank you first and foremost for the opportunity to talk about this issue. I just want to remind the listeners, as I said a moment ago, if you want to get more information about how caregivers can be supported, and if you are a caregiver and you're trying to get resources, both local and national resources, go to aarp.org/caregiving. And you'll get all that information right off, from at your convenience. And so last thing I want to say is this: caregiving is a big part of our world, our society, our community. And we applaud each and every caregiver who are spending. There are 840,000 caregivers just in Massachusetts. Thanks to each and every one of them for doing your part in helping your loved ones stay at home longer. We applaud you, and we're fighting for you, and we hope at AARP that this law gets passed so things can be better for you.
We have been speaking with Mike Festa. He is the AARP Massachusetts State Director. Mike, once again, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Kevin. Thank you very much, and have a great summer.
And that's all the program that we have for you here on Community Chat. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, have a good day.